Far Cry 6 finally arrived on October 7th to mixed but mostly positive reception from players and critics. As I predicted, it feels pretty familiar if you've played previous Far Cry games, but that's not to say it doesn't do anything new or different. Combat requires more strategy in your approach, progression is a lot more complicated, and there's way more to do in the world. In this video, I'm going to give my thoughts on how well all of this works. I want to avoid generalizations, and I won't be focusing on graphics, technical performance, or similar issues, as there are much better sources for that than me. This review also won't include a simple rating out of 10, or even tell you whether to buy the game, wait for a sale, or ignore it entirely. I'm just going to be judging Far Cry 6 as a Far Cry game, getting to the core issues of why the design of the game works, or why it doesn't, and after that, you can make decisions based on your own judgment. Additionally, this review will be completely spoiler-free for everything beyond the introductory tutorial island. Let's start with what Far Cry 6 does best, the world of Yara. Attention to detail, variety of landscapes, and a bevy of fun traversal options make this the best Far Cry world yet, which is not something I say lightly. Yara is a much more complete world than other recent games, with a near-perfect balance of untamed wilderness, unobtrusive trails and paths, and man-made infrastructure. The mountains and valleys are gorgeous, especially at dawn and sundown, and the points of interest in civilized society usually avoid being generic and feeling like simple filler material. Written notes, signs, and other small indicators bring these places to life and give the player a sense of a lost country, as many structures are uninhabited. Sometimes this goes a little too far, and the small towns and semi-urban environments can feel too devoid of life. While it's true that, according to the narrative, much of Yara's population has fled the country, it would have been nice to see towns like Concepcion and El Este and the capital city of Esperanza be a bit more populated. Speaking of Esperanza, this is probably the only part of the map that disappointed me. While it is huge and fun to traverse where possible, the playable area is, in practice, much smaller than it first appears. The city is under heavy martial law, which justifies the world designer's choices to block off large parts of it with insurmountable walls. The only way around is through very specific, linear paths, which was cool at first but quickly became frustratingly restrictive. Don't get me wrong, Esperanza and the challenge it brings with higher level enemies is still fun to explore and fight inside, but it feels like a bit of a missed opportunity. Where Far Cry 6's map really shines is the vast, open expanses outside the walls of the tightly patrolled capital. Some of the most important places you can find out in the world are checkpoints and F&D bases. Checkpoints are small hostile areas, usually populated by 4 to 5 enemies with stationary turrets and mortars that restrict movement on main roads with the use of road spikes. These have created some of my favorite engagements in the game because they rarely lead to long, drawn-out battles. They provide quick, bite-sized pieces of action, and one of their best aspects is they can be used to stop enemy vehicles once you capture them for Libertad. Using this feature to stop trucks carrying metal, gasoline, and medicine is a great way to secure some camp resources for yourself early in the game. F&D bases are the outposts of Far Cry 6, placed at strategic locations such as manufacturing plants, oil depots, and even a weather station or two. These have more enemies than checkpoints and can lead to longer battles if you get caught and trigger an alarm, so they usually require a more strategic approach. While I haven't captured all of them yet, the ones I've done so far have offered a good variety of styles and approaches, from the long-range engagements of open-air forts to the tight close-quarters combat of Yara's top university. I really like that you can complete bonus objectives for more rewards, but there doesn't appear to be any way to reset the F&D bases to a hostile state, either individually or all at once, as you could do in past games. Certain ones may be reset by chance as part of the weekly insurgency events once you finish the main story, but I really wish there was a way to do this manually instead of waiting for a random in-game event to reset the ones you want. Outposts have taken a huge step back in replayability in Far Cry 6, and it's a real shame because they're otherwise really well designed and fun to take over. The rest of the world includes military-related activities such as anti-aircraft cannons to destroy, supply airdrops to intercept, guerrilla ambushes, convoy hijacks, and more, as well as explorational side missions like Gran Premio races and treasure hunts. These various quests help lead players to some really cool parts of the map, and encourage discovery without making it feel tedious, as well as offering some pretty significant rewards. The military activities especially help create the feel of a true guerrilla revolution, as most of them allow the player to choose their preferred combat approach and plan to steal resources and cripple the Castillo regime strategically.
Danny, you have outdone yourself.
As I mentioned, Yara is a joy to travel around, primarily because the world draws you in and makes you want to find out more about it, but also because vehicles are fantastic in Far Cry 6. Don't get me wrong, the stereotypically janky Ubisoft driving is still somewhat present, but small adjustments at least make it feel better than Far Cry 5 and New Dawn. Moreover, each vehicle feels unique and has its own handling and sense of weight to it. A 4x4 pickup rips over off-road terrain with ease and feels torquey and powerful on Yara's paved roads, while heavy prisoner trucks accelerate like buses and turn like boats. This extends to aerial vehicles as well. Lighter planes and helicopters feel nimbler, while their heavily armored cousins sometimes strain under their own weight, despite clearly having more power behind the rotors. In short, driving, flying, and boating are all pretty satisfying, and I often needlessly hijacked new vehicles just to see how they felt different from the other ones. As good as the vehicles are, though, I have found that the best source of horsepower in Far Cry 6 is the horses themselves. I can honestly say that before playing, I fully expected horseback riding to be a gimmick that I tried just once to see something new before switching back to Old Reliable. Instead, I experienced the exact opposite. Horses are fast, extremely nimble, and an absolute blast to ride. While they can get a little hesitant about jumping off of cliffs or wading through water, whereas I've never had an ATV complain to me about such things, they're extremely useful for traversing the hundreds of guerrilla trails and accessing hard-to-reach destinations. Also, what better aesthetic is there than horseback on a mountain ridge at sunset? While the world is the arena in which Far Cry 6 takes place, the weapons in combat form the core gameplay experience. There's a wide variety of base weapons, each of which also has a unique variant with pre-applied mods, and new weapons are being added to the game every week through Lola's Black Market store and the weekly Insurgency rewards. While some weapons are clearly much better than others, almost all are viable at any level of the game, and it's been fun to experiment with different loadouts. In fact, my only complaint about the weapon variety is that the Resolver weapons feel relatively weak and gimmicky, although I guess we should have expected that when the pre-order bonus was a disc launcher that played the Macarena. Overall, though, this is the largest and most diverse roster of weapons in a Far Cry game to date, but what's really new about the weapons in combat in Far Cry 6 is the extent to which you can change them. Most guns have a variety of attachment mods that can be equipped, including muzzles, optics, and lasers, as well as additional power-up mods such as faster reloads and increased damage. However, none of these are as important as the ammo type mod. For most standard guns, players can choose between standard, soft target, armor-piercing, blast, poison, and incendiary rounds, with some launchers offering additional options such as EMP grenades. This system builds on recent Far Cry games, wherein armor-piercing and incendiary options were available but mostly gratuitous. In Far Cry 6, the choice is much more important. Enemy soldiers, depending on their class, are much more susceptible to certain types of ammo and resistant to others. On the bright side, this encourages more thoughtful approaches to combat. Using the right ammo type to match the enemies you're fighting gives you a huge combat advantage and significantly reduces the time to kill. However, in practice, armor-piercing rounds are far and away the dominant meta. They guarantee one-shot kills on both armored and soft target enemies with headshots with almost any weapon, and still kill enemies very quickly with body shots. While it can be helpful to have a gun or two with soft target ammo, as well as a few options with blast rounds or EMP grenades to deal with vehicles, the flexibility of armor-piercing ammo makes other types feel almost as gratuitous as the extra choices in Far Cry 5 and New Dawn. This is probably a necessary design choice because, if the ammo types were more balanced, it would be very difficult to pick a well-rounded loadout, and players would feel overly restricted in the choices they could make. While I appreciate the idea of picking the right tool for the right job, I don't think Far Cry 6's ammo system adds anything particularly valuable to the experience. The game would not be worse off if it had a simpler system, and the strategy it adds to the combat probably could have been implemented in a simpler or more meaningful way. Fortunately, one consequence of armor-piercing ammo's dominance means that combat tends to be crisp and satisfying in Far Cry 6, at least as soon as you turn off the pointless enemy health bars. AP rounds fly straight and fast, and they crack helmets like grade A eggs. Takedowns with the machete are also wonderfully brutal and fun. The difficulty is on the easier side, but feels mostly well balanced, with no trace of New Dawn's annoying bullet-spongy enemies as long as you aren't using the default standard ammo. I would argue that Far Cry 6 actually avoids bullet sponges too much. The heavy gunners and flamers that pose significant threats in past Far Cry games with their ability to soak up damage in their armor are much weaker in Far Cry 6, resistant to soft target ammo but able to be taken down with just a single headshot using armor-piercing rounds. While dropping a heavy gunner with a single shot from my M9 handgun was satisfying the first time I did it, I quickly found myself missing the challenge that was present in past titles. Additionally, stealth mechanics feel better in Far Cry 6 than in recent games, although enemies react to your presence before fully detecting you, and security cameras can interrupt the flow of stealth in some places. In my experience, these have been simple changes to get used to rather than problems with how stealth works. Overheating suppressors, EMP gadgets to deal with alarms, better takedowns, and stealth-oriented gear all provide for an expanded stealth experience with more room for creativity and strategy than in many past Far Cry games. Perhaps the most noticeable difference between Far Cry 6 and all preceding Far Cry games is the adoption of a gear system in place of permanently earned skills or perks. Players can equip 5 different pieces of clothing at a time, and each piece of clothing or armor offers certain perks or alterations to the player's abilities. Additional perks and an ultimate ability can be equipped with a Supremo backpack. Several other Ubisoft games have had very similar systems before, and Far Cry 6 tends to feature the same benefits and suffer from the same problems that those games did. Some pros of this system are that individual gear pieces can be balanced to provide much more powerful abilities than perks on a skill tree because players can only equip so many at a time. For example, the Dark Tech gloves cause throwing knives and axes to lock onto enemies. This would be ridiculously overpowered as a permanently earned skill, but in the gear system, players must give up other perks such as the ability to carry more handgun ammo or run faster while weapons are holstered. These more powerful perks tied to specific gear pieces can make for some really fun combinations, like loadouts specifically designed to make you very good at stealth, or a parkour kit that makes you run faster than much of Yara's wildlife. Additionally, some abilities that typically had to be unlocked with perks or upgrades, such as carrying a full 4-weapon loadout or performing takedowns from over a barrier, below or above an enemy, are now available at the start of the game, which is a nice quality of life change that makes sense given your character's military background. However, this is where the upside ends for the gear system. Despite generally more powerful abilities, I still feel too limited sometimes by only being able to equip 5 pieces of gear at a time. The depth of abilities available to a player at any given time has increased, but the breadth has diminished at least as drastically. The result is that you're stuck either not able to perform all of the gameplay moves you want to at one time, or you have to constantly open the menu and switch out the gear you're wearing every time your situation changes. This is often true of both weapons and gear, and while requiring players to think critically about how they approach situations is a fresh and welcome dynamic in Far Cry, it's annoying and immersion breaking to have to jump into menus and switch up my loadout whenever I face a new situation. Sometimes I just want to play the game. Unfortunately, these problems are inherent to the gear system, but they could at least be alleviated with some quality of life changes. For controller players, adding a setting to change the cursor speed in menus could make things much easier because it feels way too slow once you develop the muscle memory for where everything is. Even more importantly, Far Cry 6 needs a loadout page where players can create several preset classes with selected weapon, gear, and Supremo slots that can be equipped all at once with the press of a button. These options wouldn't get rid of the depth versus breadth problem created by the gear system, but they would greatly reduce the time spent in menus and increase time actually playing the game. Overall, I understand why Ubisoft felt the need to change how perks worked in Far Cry 6, lest they be criticized for it being a carbon copy of past games in the series. The problem is that they changed it in the least creative way possible, simply adopting a format that they had already used in their other games. Reviewers looking for Far Cry to do something different were mostly satiated, but the experience for dedicated players was not made better off. I'm confident that if Far Cry 6 retained the exact same perk system as Far Cry 5, or better yet, Far Cry 3 and 4, it would have received lower review scores from game journalists, but much more praise from players themselves. If Ubisoft was committed to implementing a gear system no matter what, I think a better way to do it would have been a mixed format with some permanent perks for takedowns and increasing ammo carrying capacity, along with more powerful and unique gear-specific ones. The permanent perks could easily have been tied into the Guerrilla Camp upgrades, so Far Cry 6 could have avoided a perk point system while still alleviating some of the issues with the gear system, but instead, it unfortunately feels half-baked. Weapons and gear aren't the only progression systems in Far Cry 6. There are also guerrilla camps, the Los Bandidos missions, Libertad ranks, and more, each of which comes with its own unlocks for abilities, weapons, gear, and loot. For the sake of time, I won't go into how well each of these works, but it is necessary to briefly discuss how progression through the game feels as a whole. While individually each progression system is pretty good in Far Cry 6, altogether these systems lack synergy. It's not that they're poorly designed, although if I were in charge of it I certainly would have changed the pacing of some of them. Rather, just the sheer number of separate progression systems and the time required to invest into them can be daunting for new players. While Far Cry 6 is familiar in many ways to the past games, perhaps its biggest difference with past entries is the ease of learning the game. This isn't a problem for dedicated players like me who kept up with news about the game before launch and planned on spending a large amount of time in Yara no matter what, but it can be frustrating to more casual players who just want to hop in and start fighting a dictator. I've found that short 20 to 30 minute play sessions are much less practical and productive in Far Cry 6 than in past games because so much more time is spent agonizing over how to prioritize limited resources, which upgrades to pursue, and where to go next. Players have to carefully decide where to send their Bandito leaders, which camp facility to upgrade next, which weapon mod to unlock, which Resolver weapon or backpack to buy, whether to spend pesos now or hope to find guns and gear out in the world, and more. This design encourages thoughtful play, which is a good thing in my eyes, but the upshot is that risky resource decisions are discouraged, and it doesn't feel like Far Cry 6 strikes the right balance for this trade-off. In Far Cry 5, picking an optic attachment for a gun only to find that I didn't like how it looked was virtually inconsequential. In Far Cry 6, the same mistake is now much more costly. The gunpowder expended in the purchase represents a huge opportunity cost of time and other mods that could have been bought instead. The same decision logic applies to virtually every upgrade system in the game. The good news is that eventually this becomes less of a problem, as unlocks and purchases for mods and gadgets are permanent, and resources become easier to gather later in the game. The problem I'm worried about is that so many players will get annoyed at these various systems before they get to this point. In my last video before Far Cry 6 released, I noted that the story was one of the biggest reasons I was excited for the game. I had high expectations, especially because for me, the story includes not just the events of the game and main missions and cutscenes, but also the whole atmosphere the game creates and the development of an interesting, believable world. I have a lot of good things to say about the story of Far Cry 6, but I want to start with the negatives. As promised, this will all be completely spoiler-free beyond the introductory portion of the game. It feels incredibly strange to say, but the worst part about Far Cry 6's story is the antagonists. Anton Castillo certainly has his powerful moments, largely carried by Giancarlo Esposito's excellent performance, but even he feels somewhat shallow and one-dimensional in his development as a character. The minor antagonists, such as Jose Castillo, Maria Marquesa, Sean McKay, and Admiral Benitez, are all completely flat, comically evil characters who are so morally bankrupt without any rationale for being this way that they come off as totally unbelievable. This makes it easier to justify Libertad's revolution against the Castillo regime, but at the cost of authenticity.
Free elections, free expression, free the outcasts. Ayara free of Castillos. Simple.
Real revolutions, even against the worst tyrannies, are always morally fraught undertakings, but Far Cry 6's attitude toward revolt comes off as a bit overeager because its villains are weak caricatures of real-world evil. While it's nice for Far Cry to mostly step away from the "actually the bad guy was right all along" trope that it's done in the past, Far Cry 6 tries too hard not to let us understand the motivations and morals of its villains. The biggest redeeming feature about the antagonist side in Far Cry 6 is Diego Castillo. The development of his relationship with Anton, his own views of Libertad and the Yaran people, and his growing ability to make decisions for himself as a young man add depth to the story that the otherwise weak villains can't provide. Diego's role in the revolution poses tough questions for both Anton and Libertad, and in some sense he is caught in the middle of these two forces. His decisions not only carry weight, but are also unpredictable, as he is a developing character whose personality and worldview are not nearly as set in stone as those around him. In this way, he makes the story much more interesting and prevents it from being a completely black and white, good versus evil narrative. My other complaint about the story of Far Cry 6 is about the pacing. The best way I can describe it is that it simply feels too easy to be taking an entire country sometimes. It's not that the story is short, I think it totals about 25 hours if you rush straight through it, but it certainly feels like the small victories do much more to advance Libertad's cause than the big setbacks do to slow it down. Compare this to Far Cry 4, where it felt like you had to fight ruthlessly for territory the whole time, and setbacks like the attack on Banapur early in the game felt like real losses. That's not to say that the bumps in Libertad's story aren't emotionally hard-hitting, they are, but they also don't seem to be huge strategic defeats. At the end of the story in each region, regardless of how much time it took me to complete it, I was left feeling like it all happened too quickly. Aside from the pacing though, the story progression works surprisingly well. I was skeptical about the return of the regional approach, with 3 separate stories that can be completed in any order, but the implementation of a more linear style within each region, as well as a few independent story missions not tied to a specific sub-narrative, makes the progression significantly more coherent than it was in Far Cry 5. The tone is also more coherent, and although it's a little more lighthearted than I would prefer at times, it doesn't feel bipolar as in Far Cry 5. Far Cry 6 hits the emotional parts hard and doesn't take away from them with a feeling of tonal whiplash. Additionally, in terms of gameplay, the main missions are pretty good overall. While the smaller missions can be somewhat tedious and repetitive, the big missions, of which there are 2 or 3 in each region, are a lot of fun and absolutely blow anything from Far Cry 5 and New Dawn out of the water, in my opinion. In particular, the Libertad Rises mission, in which you break the blockade of the starting island, is an instant classic for me, up there with the best of Far Cry 3 and 4's story missions. Before I get into my favorite thing about Far Cry 6's story, I want to discuss the auxiliary elements of the narrative that are important for setting the stage for the main events. By way of interesting locations in the world, conversations between fellow guerrillas, a vast number of written notes, and a type of side mission called Yaran Stories, the world of Yara is fully fleshed out with history, culture, and context for the events that take place in the game. All of these small pieces come together to form an atmosphere of unrest and a sense of hope and hardiness for the future that adds much needed meaning to almost everything you do in Yara. Even the original soundtrack, which may not be as immediately catchy as Far Cry 5's but is still just as heartfelt, helps adjust the mood of the game according to the situation. When you slow down and take the time to absorb all of these things, you feel enveloped in the world and interested in its people far more than recent Far Cry games, and perhaps the most out of any Far Cry game.
I am grateful for all that you have done for our country.
The best part of Far Cry 6's story, though, is the protagonists. Danny Rojas, the main character, is likable and talkative, even monologuing during some scenes. Danny's relationships with other allies and potential allies are a key point of the story and develop some of its most important themes, especially centering around family, trust, and identity. As I said earlier, the over-the-top evil of the antagonists hurts the authenticity of Libertad's revolution, but Danny's interaction with other protagonists across various factions that have different demographics, goals, and values ultimately redeem the story and give it the human depth it deserves. Many months ago, I made a video asking whether Far Cry 6 could solve what I called the loneliness problem, which was an issue in past Far Cry games in which the player felt isolated like a one-man army despite ostensibly being part of a larger movement. I can now finally answer that question with a resounding yes. Where Far Cry 5 and even Far Cry 4 failed to convincingly make the player feel like part of something bigger, the story and gameplay of Far Cry 6 absolutely create the sense that Danny is just one piece, though a catalyzing one, in a much greater revolution. The tragedies and triumphs Danny experiences alongside allies, as well as main missions that involve the help of others to a much greater extent than ever before, come together with the atmosphere and tone of Far Cry 6 to create not just a revolution, but a group of revolutionaries that the player can genuinely care about, be invested in, and root for. This is by far the biggest accomplishment of Far Cry 6. For as many good things as I have to say about the story, it eventually ends, and the job of Far Cry 6 is to entertain you even after it's all said and done. Ubisoft has an impressive amount of post-launch support planned with free content updates extending through at least March, on top of the regular paid Season Pass editions. There are also weekly insurgencies for Danny to crush, and weekly updates to Lola's Black Market store, where unique gear and high-powered weapons can be purchased. The weekly tasks give players a reason to play at least a few hours a week, and I'm genuinely looking forward to the content updates, which will include new special operations and spin-off missions. However, much of this in-game content relies on novelty rather than exploiting the fun of the core gameplay loop of Far Cry 6, and I am worried about how long it can hold players' attention. I can think of a number of features that would improve the long-term playability of the game, especially a New Game Plus option that I hope will eventually be added like it was in Far Cry 5, but the biggest thing missing from Far Cry 6 is a map editor. While it's understandable that Ubisoft wanted to use all of their available resources and manpower while working from home to focus on developing the core single-player experience, I can't help but find myself thinking of all the possibilities a map editor could offer in this game. There's a huge number of physical assets, and the new weapon and gear systems could make for some really interesting loadout settings in an editor. To be fair, there is an immense amount of content to go back through in single player, but as more players reach the endgame and find themselves waiting between content updates, I think the absence of a map editor will be felt much more keenly. It's hard to say Far Cry 6 is an incomplete game, but after so many years of the franchise having a reliable map editor and multiplayer mode to fall back on, it's also hard to avoid the feeling that something is missing. Taking into consideration all of the elements I've covered up to this point, it's time to give a summary judgment. Far Cry 6 had a lot to live up to with a long and storied franchise like this, but it also wasn't fully given the benefit of the doubt because of growing criticisms over the quality and originality of recent Ubisoft games. So, how did it fare? Mechanically, Far Cry 6 is far from a perfect game. Progression systems that try to do too much, and weapon and gear systems that increase the game's complexity without necessarily adding value to the core gameplay will likely be criticized as poor design choices as opinions settle during the coming months. And despite these new systems, the overall feel of the game is very similar to past entries, perhaps too familiar for many people. But the truth is, the classic open-world shooter Far Cry formula still works very well, at least this one last time. It's nearly impossible not to smile a little the first time you incinerate an enemy vehicle, rampage through a checkpoint, or watch a helicopter spiral to its fiery death after you win a tense battle. And Far Cry 6 keeps you busy doing all of this, while still giving you the time and space to breathe when you need it. But while this core gameplay loop is what carried past Far Cry games to success, here it's only of secondary importance. In this entry, the much more fundamental aim of the game is to provide an experience. Far Cry 6 promised to transport you to a vibrant, exotic Caribbean island nation full of history, culture, and mystery, toss you into a guerrilla revolution with all the grit, conflict, tragedy, and triumph it can muster, and have you see that revolution through all the way to the streets of the capital city. It absolutely delivers on this promise. In short, Far Cry 6 isn't perfect because it doesn't have to be. To be sure, there are shortcomings in the design of some game mechanics, and these might unfortunately deter some players from picking up the game or finishing it the whole way through. But in my estimation, these problems pale in comparison to the overall experience available to players. Far Cry 6 set out with the goal to deliver a fun, earnest, and human account of the guerrilla experience, and it accomplished this goal with flying colors. That makes it a success, if you ask me.